Welcome to a legendary video. Today I'll be going over the first ever legendary Pow Pow designs. These designs are the ones that I've struggled with the most so far. I finally got them to a place where I'm happy to show them off, but just before that, I'd like to share a story with you. So get comfy as I go over the legend of the 4 heroes and the tower. Long ago, the land of Leka was split into 4 separate kingdoms. The Kingdom of Angels rests upon the high alpines. The Kingdom of Souls lies deep in the wild woods. The Kingdom of Brutes dwells within the stone cavern. And the Kingdom of Warriors resides in the bitter tundra. Each kingdom and its people saw themselves and their way of life as superior in comparison to the other 3. Over time, this led to sour relations and caused many conflicts among the 4 kingdoms, eventually isolating them from one another. The area amid the 4 kingdoms was known as the Lands in Between, inhabited by those cast out from their respective kingdoms for not fitting in with their kingdom's philosophy and way of being. Life in these lands proved challenging, as the 4 kingdoms ruined this land with war and waste throughout the ages. The people in the lands in between grew weak and desperate as time passed on, until one day, a mysterious tower seemingly out of nowhere had erected itself before them. Although surrounded by flames, the tower seemed to take no damage from the raging fires. The desperate people of the lands in between believed the building to be their savior, and revered it as their god. The tower spoke and assured the people that it would reunite the land of Leka, and that they would all be made equal under its rule. And so the people were gifted with fire from the tower. They spread the flames of their lord throughout the lands, spurring the tower to grow ever larger and larger. The tower eventually grew so tall that it could be seen from all 4 kingdoms. While the tower and its stature seemed unnerving, the kingdoms ignored it because it lied outside of their domain. The followers of the tower seemed to grow more mad and violent as their numbers and influence grew. The tower now had a sizable legion of followers, made up of people from the lands in between, conspirators from within the kingdoms, and infernal beasts born from the flames of the tower itself. Their growth in size meant they could go to greater lengths to spread the word of the fire, and to recruit more followers for their lord. Riding on fiery beasts, they began their crusade on the 4 kingdoms. However, the kingdoms were incredibly formidable in combat and easily fended off these initial attacks. But the followers of the tower were relentless. Their flames never ceased to go out, all the while their numbers seemed to gradually grow as the war pressed on. The continuous assaults chipped away at each kingdom's mighty armor, forcing them to dedicate all their manpower to war, depleting their other resources. Each on the verge of collapse, the kingdoms realized that their only hope to defeat this evil was to call upon one another for aid, and to launch a raid on the followers' source of the fire, the tower. Each kingdom agreed to send their greatest champion on a quest to destroy the tower. The Kingdom of Angels called upon the champion of the spear, the Kingdom of Souls, the champion of the sword, the Kingdom of Brutes, the champion of the mace, and the Kingdom of Warriors, the champion of the shield. Leaving their home kingdoms, the champions rode out on their trusted mounts to group up. The mounts they rode on were revered as much as they were, incredible beasts that fought along their champion's side through countless battles. It is believed that the unbreakable bond between the champions and their mount is what makes them both so incredibly strong. Each champion has strength worth 1,000 men, but it also came with lots of pride. Each of them wanted to bring back honor to their respective kingdoms by slaying the tower. The initial gathering of the champions was full of unpleasantries and hostilities. A team composed of champions from rivaling kingdoms was going to have its challenges, but at this point the situation was dire. There was no choice but to join in arms and begin the quest to topple the tower. The lack of cooperation between the 4 throughout their journey made it clear that they were fighting alongside each other for the sake of their respective kingdom, but not for the others. At last, the champions and their mounts had reached the tower and began their attack. The tower lashed out in blazing pillars. The flames of the tower proved much more challenging than the champions expected. The champions and their mounts struggled against the colossal tower. Fighting individually, they could not make any headway against their foe, and were beginning to tire. While the champions slowed down, the tower laid upon them a critical blow. Weakened, the champions realized that working together would be the only way to bring down such a mighty enemy. Summoning their last bit of strength, they launched an all-out attack, working as one to fell the tower. With flawless technique, they left an enormous wound on the tower. The tower shrieked in pain, and its fire began to dim. But still, it did not fall. The champions, sapped out of might, were left defenseless to the tower's next attack. With a searing beam, the tower burnt the champions until all that waited for them was death to take them away. The champions' beast cried out for their lost riders. However, the champions' will, combined with the bonds of their mounts, were so strong that the remaining life energy from each champion flowed out from within them, causing them and their weapons to disintegrate and were absorbed by each of their mounts. The 4 mounts underwent a blinding transformation and took on appearances that resembled the likeness of their champion and their respective weapon. The power of their champion was coursing through them. With a quick glance shared between them, their next move was clear: slay the tower and avenge their fallen comrades. With every scorching flame summoned by the tower, the beast shook them off as though they were splashed by water. Rushing through, working as one, they laid upon the tower an onslaught of attacks. Under such grave wounds, the tower finally crumbled, and the fires raging throughout the lands were at last extinguished. The people of the kingdoms praised the 4 heroes for saving them. In admiration of their teamwork and victory, the 4 kingdoms put aside their differences to help one another rebuild the land. After some time, the kingdoms peacefully merged and lived under one land, united. With no threat looming over the land, the 4 beasts went their separate ways and hid themselves from the world. People put up shrines of the mighty heroes, paying their respects and wishing for their continued protection of the land. However, the remaining followers of the tower believed that the tower's fire was not truly extinguished, and that someday it will return, burning brighter than before. But the people of the land have faith that in their most desperate time of need, the 4 heroes will return. And that is the tale of the 4 heroes and the tower. Thanks for bearing with my subpar storytelling skills, but I hope you were still able to find it interesting and were able to follow along with the story. In case you prefer to read the story later, I'll have a written version of it in the description below. But enough of that, as I'm sure you're all eager for the reveal of the Legendaries. So let's get it started with their hero of the spear. Once I decided that I was going to do Legendary Pow Pow, I knew that these Pow Pow needed to have something special about them that made them legendary. And I instantly gravitated towards stories of legendary heroes fighting off great evils. It's a classic story trope and one that felt fitting for my first Legendaries. So I began formulating a rough draft of a story in my head and decided that instead of 1 hero that it would be 4. Each belonging to a different kingdom and specializing in a particular weapon. I landed on a spear as one of these weapons, and the idea I had for the design was pretty straightforward. A unicorn-like creature, but the horn is a spear. Since they are going to be based on mounts, a horse-like creature just made a lot of sense as a starting point. However, I didn't want to do a straight up horse since it's a bit boring and I really wanted to push myself to do more ambiguous creatures. So I tried to go for a much more dragon-like head for this unicornish creature, but the horns kind of ended up making it look like an antelope, which is fine too. Overall, I felt like the face was still interesting enough to keep it from looking too much like a deer or a horse, which was the goal. I also had the general idea of the origins and themes of this Pow Pow. Graceful and heavenly. Both the spear and the inspiration of a unicorn just really lent itself towards those themes, and I wasn't above it. I thought they were good directions to take this Pow Pow and would eventually help me to establish a rough theme among the other 3 of the quartet. I also felt that the feminine touches to this design kind of subverted what people usually think of when they think a legendary hero or a knight, so it was nice to immediately start off with this theming to encourage variety among the quartet. The next real challenge I faced was establishing what does a legendary Pow Pow even look like. Since this is the first one I am designing, it kind of sets the tone for the others I plan to design. Well, one way to make it appear special is to make it a bit more detailed and complex when compared to my other Pow Pow. But since these legendaries are relic Pow Pow, I didn't want them to look too wildly different from regular Pow Pow, since as far as how strong or powerful they are not levels beyond regular Pow Pow. They're just incredibly rare and are on average much stronger than most regular Pow Pow. But for the most part, a strong regular Pow Pow would be able to stand toe to toe against a relic Pow Pow. So if their power and strength are not too far apart from one another, then their design and appearances should somehow communicate that by not being too different design-wise. They should look like they belong together, but with the relic Pow Pow having just a bit of extra flair to be seen as special. So overall, the main body of the Pow Pow did read decently normal to me, which is what I wanted. I played with different types of armors and fittings to give this Pow Pow extra flair, and eventually landed on having these ribbon-like parts that would flow along the creature's body. It fit its heavenly theming and pushes that feminine, graceful touch I wanted in this design. The armor and ribbons also give it that legendary feel I was looking for without going too far or too crazy with the design. It took a lot of playing with patterns and colors to get it to a place where there wasn't too much negative space and enough detail to keep the design interesting. The headpiece was another big struggle of mine, since I wasn't really sure how it worked or what to do to make it look right. So I toyed with that a bit too, and even drew it in a different angle to make sure it made sense in a 3D form. The last touch to the design was redesigning the horn bit, since some people I showed it to mistook it for an arrow, which I completely understand. So I played around with it to better resemble a spear. The spear horn is a very central part of the design, so I'm glad I went back to give it a better and more interesting shape. So now to present Lancet, the hero of the spear. There have been sightings of this Pow Pow leaping through the sky as though it were flying. Ancient accounts speak of the creature's incredible swiftness and agility. Battling this Pow Pow is made even more difficult with the blinding light that emits from its spear. It is said to resemble a great champion from long ago. As you can see, there is no color variant for legendary Pow Pow since they are one of a kind. So I decided to put its relic there instead, since it is a relic Pow Pow after all. This Pow Pow's relic is Heaven's Spear, a precious weapon belonging to its former champion. You might have also noticed that this Pow Pow has the newly added Mystic type. I've been considering adding this type for a long time now, but had yet designed a Pow Pow that really needed it until now, with Lancet. I love the fairy type in Pokemon, and I wanted a type similar to that, but that also expanded upon it. At first, it was going to be the Halo type, which would kind of be like the foil to the Demon type I recently added. But I wasn't really happy with how that sounded or the implications. I finally came up with the Mystic type instead, and overall I felt that it achieves that similar vibe of angels and heaven while also being able to incorporate other themes similar to that of the fairy type. But yeah, this is Lancet, my first legendary design, and I think this is a great starting point for what legendary Pow Pow can look like. But of course, the definition and range of what a legendary Pow Pow can look like will widen over time as I continue to put out designs and better hone my craft. But now that we have our first member of our quartet, let's move on to the next, the hero of the sword, Bylade. Making legendary Pow Pows centered around weapons, I of course had to do a sword. It's the go-to weapon most people think about, but also in general, I just have a big thing for swords. I have no idea why though. Now, I have to be upfront about this. I am a pretty big fan of Zacian. The trope of a dog or a wolf holding a sword is cool to me. It's cheesy and even a bit silly, but I don't know, it just really gets me as a big dog and sword lover. So I couldn't resist doing my own spin on the trope. Of course, I am prepared for the comparisons to be drawn between the two, but I didn't want the fact that Zacian existed to prevent me from doing a design I really wanted to do. And it just so perfectly worked in this quartet. Starting off, the big problem I have with Zacian is that it holds its sword in its mouth. It makes the weapon feel very detached from the creature itself, and it feels like two separate elements rather than one single unit. But the most annoying thing about it for me is the fact that it takes up its mouth. So it's unable to communicate or eat or anything of the sort, which feels troublesome and annoying. That part of Zacian has always bothered me, so I knew I wanted to incorporate it differently for my design. I still wanted to put the sword near the head though, since when imagining a four-legged creature trying to swing a sword, I felt like it could only really do it with its head. I decided to attach it to the headpiece similarly to how I did it with Lancet, and I think overall it looks alright. A bit jarring potentially, but I think it works well enough. It almost gives the illusion of it holding it in its mouth without it actually being so. Now, to further separate this design from Zacian and give it its own identity, I wanted this Pow Pow to have a totally different personality and feel to Zacian's honorable and dutiful nature. So I went with the idea of a savage, berserker-like warrior. This berserker attribute ties well with the sword theming and also leans more heavily into my own personal biases, which is always a big plus. Because it was going to have a much more savage and chaotic demeanor, I wanted to push the design in a more hyena direction, but I think in the end, it does end up looking quite wolfish. Since it was going to be crazed looking and sword themed, it needed to be sharper and more dangerous looking. So I added these giant blade-like shoulder pieces that I think does well to accentuate the danger and help better define its silhouette. I wanted to play with it having flowing hair like a sort of cape, but I found that it complicated the top portion of the design and interfered with the shoulder blades. I eventually do go with the wolf-like tail that also helped add flowiness into the design and help balance out the body. With the theme of the Berserker, I thought about how Berserkers usually get stronger the closer they are to dying. Therefore, I thought theming it around the spirit typing would be a perfect fit for this design. Plus, the spirit type kind of contrasted well against the angelic spear pow pow I had just made, so the color choices were made with that in mind. Like with Lancet, I played around with adornments and patterns until the design felt balanced and well-rounded. It's always a bit of a challenge for me since I like to keep the overall design simple, but I don't want there to be big splotches of blank space in the design either. But the design was shaping up, so let's meet Bylate, the hero of the sword. Ancient tales recall the offensive capabilities of this pow pow. It specializes on unleashing a flurry of slashes until its foe either tires or is too sliced up to move. Bylade does not seem to fear death. It actually seems to grow stronger the more fatal its wounds are. Bylade's relic is the Soul Blade, an ancient weapon belonging to the champion of the sword. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this design. It hits all the marks I needed to, but it's not 100% satisfaction for me. Since I love swords and dogs, this design should be a grand slam, but I think something about it still isn't hitting completely for me. I think the way the hair sits and connects with the tail is a bit odd, so I may have to address that eventually, but like with my other designs, I try not to get too hung up over those things right now. 90% satisfaction is good enough, and I have plenty of time to go back and improve designs later when I'm more experienced. But now that we're done with this sword hero, it's time to move on to the hero of the mace. The mace was actually the last weapon I decided on. It fits in well with the others, being a medieval-ish weapon, but was pretty different as it is more of a bashing weapon rather than a piercing or slashing weapon. Though with the mace, I was worried about how to fit this particular weapon into the design of a creature. But a mace is just too cool of a weapon not to do, and again it added variety to my already two blade-like weapons. At first, I had this alligator-like sketch that I was going to use for the shield design, but I thought the spikes I gave it kind of also reflect the spikes on a mace. So I took that design and added some much more obvious spikes to it. I would also be adding a spiked ball to the end of the tail since it felt like it would be the best place for it. And it's a key part of the mace. But I didn't like how it looked and it felt very basic, so I scrapped it and tried again. I really wanted the visuals of the mace to be integrated into its head. I felt like a mace user fights its enemies head on, so I needed it to be in the front part of its head. Plus, the other two also had it be part of their heads, so I wanted to keep the same theme going. But I had a really tough time trying to fit a mace-like motif on this crocodile snout. So that's when I decided to think of a different animal to base this design off of. And I finally came upon the Pachycephalosaurus. These dinosaurs with this bump on its head that also has spiky protrusions on it. It already kind of felt like a mace-like creature, so this was perfect creature to reference. So I started expanding on the design. I did end up bringing back a mace for its tail, which I thought felt better now that there's a main mace on the head. The two others also had the weapon part kind of be embedded in a helmet-like structure, so I went ahead and added that to this design to keep it all consistent. The mace was now much better incorporated. As I was messing with the colors and body patterns, I realized this design was way too slim. When I think of a creature that represents the mace, I imagine a much more barbaric, imposing figure. The weapon is heavy and is meant to bludgeon its foes, and the current design didn't really reflect that. It felt much more on the agile and quick side. So it was time to start bulking him up. For its body shape, I kind of wanted to push it in a sort of gorilla direction, which I think better reflected what I think of when I think of a mace. I think this also helped it stray away from looking just like a pow pow version of that dinosaur and looking much more like an ambiguous creature, which I always kind of like for my designs. Now, the body was looking really naked. I played around with these huge spiked shoulders that connected to a sort of shell-like structure. I thought this was a neat idea, but it started to feel defensive looking, which was not what I was going for. The mace is a rather offensive weapon, used to bash in enemy shields and armor. I wanted it to look like it would charge at you full force rather than sitting and waiting. So I removed the shell and kept the shoulders to keep the weight in the front. The body was beginning to look plain again. I also didn't like how the spiked ball was attached to the end of the tail. It felt like such a weird transition, so I added some armor bits to spread out the detail and better incorporate the spiked ball into the design. Next, I went to address the legs, since the stance and pose felt a bit awkward. Originally, it was standing on its two back legs, but I think I want it to be fully on its fours now, especially with all that weight in front. Since I didn't want the legs to be bare, I added some braces which added interest and added some more heft to the pow pow. I also messed with the tail mace since it had too many spikes and was complicated for such a small area of the design. Plus, it better helped me spread out the orange throughout the design. Introducing Clobbin, the hero of the Mace. Historical records of this Pow Pow's incredible destructive force has been passed down by many. Clobbin uses its incredible strength to charge head-on into its enemies. Its overwhelming strength allows it to break through all sorts of structures. Clobbin's relic is the stone mace, which once belonged to a champion from a kingdom long ago. This Pow Pow gave me the most surprises through its creation journey. Whereas the previous two were pretty consistent from the original sketch, the look and design of Clobbin changed drastically throughout the process. But that's what made designing it kind of fun. Now, let's move on to the last member of this quartet, the hero of the shield. Swords, shields, and knights just go together, so the shield was an easy choice. Starting off, I did play with an armored lizard type of concept, but since I ended up going that route for the Mace Pow Pow, I decided to go more ox/ram for the shield legendary, with the idea of being the horns resembled the shape of a shield. Since all the others had also had the weapon incorporate into the head, I wanted to stay consistent with that here. When imagining a shield user, I associate bulkiness since it is a very defensive weapon and is associated with protection. So similar to Clobbin, I wanted to keep the weight of the design in front, and wanted to put an emphasis on bulk rather than agile and slim like the spear and sword Pow Pow. This also helped the quartet be balanced in appearance, two being slim while the other two are quite bulky. I went with a sketch that kind of sat somewhere between a bunch of hooved and horned animals such as an ox, ram, goat, and even a moose. As I explored the design, I kind of wanted to lean its face away from those hooved animals and to something more like a lion or a bear. Like with the others, besides the sword one, they take inspiration from multiple species of animals to feel more whimsical and unique. I didn't want it to just be a shield ram. I felt that this new face fit quite nicely and made the design feel much more unique. The stronger lion head with the giant headpiece also made it look quite regal to me, so I decided its personality and theme would kind of be centered around that. The cape piece was kind of a placeholder initially, but it kind of worked now with its royal appearance. To further give it context, I decided this Pow Pow would have the ice type, so the cape would also act as a coat of sorts. I thought the ice typing not only does it fit the design, but I think it fit nicely with the other three types of the quartet. Mystic and Spirit kind of have their pairing, and Rock and Ice also seem like they go together. Plus, it kind of gives it Viking vibes, which I think also works well to round out this design. I eventually give it a shield piece on its chest to further call out the shield and make the design front focused. I also added some leg armor pieces to help bring back some of that armor and defensiveness that is associated with the shield. And the design was set from there. Me, Warcombe, the hero of the shield. An old tale tells of a shield that is unbreakable. Although it shines and resembles ice, it is harder than any known metal. It is believed that it rests in the bitter tundra, where harsh blizzards keep others from bothering it. Warcombe's relic is the glacial shield that once belonged to a champion from an icy kingdom. And at last we have our legendary quartet. Overall, I really like them all together. I can see myself revisiting each of their designs down the line since I really do want to perfect them the best I can, but I am happy enough with them to debut them here today. It was really tough designing each of them. Most of my other Pow Pows usually take me 1 to 3 days on average, but each of these took me about a week each. It was pretty hard since I had a rough story and concept in mind that these Pow Pow designs had to convey. So there was a certain list of requirements I had to meet for each of them. In comparison, most of my Pow Pows I made before this come from random doodles that just look cool to me. So the drawing comes pretty much before the concept most of the time. But since the concept came first, it was much harder for me this time around. Plus, they were also the first legendaries, and I had to figure out what legendary Pow Pow even looked like. And I think they do a decent job of defining that for now. But yeah, I'm pretty stoked about them. I think they do look like they belong together, and no one of them stands out too much, which was a big worry of mine. I hope the appeal between the four are somewhat even among people, but either way, I can't wait to hear what people's favorites are. I also wanted to do my best to have these Pow Pow clearly show which weapon they're based on, so I hope that comes across well. These are the first relic Pow Pow after all, and I wanted their relic items to be super apparent in their designs since it is so important. So these are the legendary 4 heroes I set out to design. But as you can see from the story, the tale is not just about the heroes. We also have to go over the tower. Now, when I was originally conceptualizing the lore behind my first legendary Pow Pow, I knew I wanted it to be about 4 heroes that overcome some great evil. But I actually didn't plan on that evil being a specific entity. It was actually going to be a very vague story about heroes defeating a darkness that threatened their kingdoms. But as I continued to craft the story, I knew it would benefit a lot to have a central villain. And a villain also provides the perfect opportunity to reveal the other classification of legendaries, Divine Pow Pow. Since Divine Pow Pow are much stronger, it going 1 against 4 made sense. Since the 4 Relic Pow Pow were based on very physical weapons, I thought its enemy should be magic based. At first I thought imagery of a wand would be good, but I thought it should stand out even more from the other 4. And since Relic Pow Pow are more of the object based mons, I wanted to scrap the idea of the wand. So for this Divine Pow Pow, I came up with the concept of a dark tower which felt perfect and still fit the vibe and feel of this medieval story. While looking up some tower inspirations, I came across the tarot card, The Tower, which depicts a tower struck by lightning and is on fire. I really love the illustrations on the tarot cards and the ominous imagery of a burning tower. I thought it would be interesting if the tower actually was burning on purpose because the flames were its source of magic and power. So the designs really explored these ideas. Since this is a Divine Pow Pow, I wanted to really push what you might consider a Pow Pow to be. This one should look quite different from most other Pow Pow to show that it is much more powerful in nature. Because Divine Pow are deity-like, I first wanted to start with the imagery that looked much more like some sort of eldritch god. But the human form was just not doing it for me in this scenario. I felt like it may be departing too far away from what a Pow Pow should look or feel like. Eventually, I do adopt a 4-legged body that I think made it much more creature-like, while still keeping that odd and unusual appearance. It also kind of tied it to the 4 heroes, which were all 4-legged mounts. So that was a nice bonus. While the design is generally simple, I wanted to really give the flames a lot of movement to give this creature an air of importance to it. I think the flowy flame bits help sell the legendary part of the design a bit more. While the imagery of a tower stuck onto a beast-like body is extremely odd, it accomplishes the otherworldly feeling I was hoping for Divine Pow Pow. Spyron, the Burning Tower Pow Pow. The story of the 4 heroes and the tower has been passed down through many in the land of Leica. While most people see the tower as a terrible being that raised havoc and chaos, some praise it for uniting the once divided land. And since this is a Divine Pow Pow rather than a Relic Pow Pow, it grants you a special charm instead. This charm is called the Eye of the Tower, and allows one of your Pow Pow to temporarily gain a demonic eye that can shoot out powerful beams of fire. I also decided to give it the demon type over the magic type, since I think it better fits its look and role in the story. Plus, I think of its powers as more demonic rather than magical. I can definitely see Spyron being a very polarizing design, but I honestly love it. I think this Pow Pow really speaks to my personal interests as far as creature designs go. To me, this is the first Pow Pow that really helps sell Pow Pow World as a different kind of creature collector. And I think it really is a design that feels unique to my sensibilities as an artist and a creator. But be sure to let me know how you feel about it, whether you love it, hate it, or just neutral. So now we have the designs for our 2 established classes of legendary Pow Pow, Relic Pow Pow and Divine Pow Pow. And to top it off, they have story and lore that is in relation to one another, that I'm pretty happy with. I think the story is simple, but it also doesn't need to be any more than that. It gives these special Pow Pow just a bit of extra attention and context in the world. And that's all I want for them, especially for the Relic Pow Pow. I have more in mind as far as origin and additional lore for Divine Pow Pow, such as Spyron, but I want to keep it a mystery for now because I think Divine Pow Pow are much more fun that way. But also because I'm still working on it. But now I'd really love to hear what y'all think of our first legendaries for Pow Pow World. Do they feel legendary to you? Do you think they represent their respective classification well, Relic and Divine Pow Pow? Like them, don't like them? I'm always really interested to know. Thoughtful feedback is always appreciated as I am a one-man team. I still have a ton planned for Pow Pow World, so I hope you'll continue watching and supporting this series. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see ya next time.